The missiles were already in the air. At least, that's what the instruments said. One man, alone at his post, staring at a screen telling him that 5 American nuclear warheads were inbound and that he had seconds, not minutes, seconds, to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike that would have killed hundreds of millions of people before the sun rose again. His finger was close to the button. The alarms were screaming. And the entire fate of human civilization rested not on a president, not on a treaty, not on a military doctrine carefully constructed over decades of Cold War tension, but on one man's gut feeling that the machine in front of him was lying. What would you have done? Most people will never know this man's name. Most people will never know how many times during those 13 days in October 1962 the world came within a single human decision of complete annihilation. The version taught in schools is cleaned up, mythologized, and stripped of the terror that actually lived inside those rooms. The Backchannel negotiations, the nuclear submarine flooding with carbon dioxide while its captain prepared to launch, the spy plane that accidentally crossed into Soviet airspace while both sides had their fingers on triggers. These stories were buried, classified, obscured, quietly removed from the version of history that got handed down. That is exactly why History Unlocked exists. Not to give you comfortable summaries, but to hand you the real thing, unfiltered, unvarnished, and at full weight. Because the truth of what happened during those 13 days is not just a history lesson. It is a warning. And if you believe that warning matters, then being part of this community is how you make sure it never gets buried again. The Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 days in October 1962. Multiple moments where civilization could have ended before most of us were born. This is what really happened. Washington, D.C., October 15th, 1962, 8:45 in the evening. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy received a phone call that made the blood drain from his face. CIA analysts reviewing U-2 spy plane photographs taken over western Cuba had identified something unmistakable: Soviet medium-range ballistic missile launch sites, positioned 90 miles off the coast of Florida, capable of carrying nuclear warheads and aimed, in effect, at the heart of the United States. Bundy made a decision that seems almost incomprehensible in retrospect. He chose not to wake the president. Kennedy needed rest. He reasoned the morning would come soon enough. That choice, to let the most powerful man in the world sleep through the discovery of the gravest nuclear threat America had ever faced on its doorstep, tells you something profound about the psychology of that moment. Nobody wanted to believe it was real. Nobody wanted to be the one standing in a doorway holding the information that might start a war. The next morning, October 16th, Bundy walked into Kennedy's bedroom while the president was still in his pajamas. He delivered the news with the controlled tone of a man trying not to cause a panic. And Kennedy's response, according to every account from those present, was not rage. It was not fear. It was something quieter and sharper than either: a cold, almost clinical fury. He said, "He can't do this to me." He was not talking about the missiles. He was talking about Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier who had met Kennedy face-to-face at the Vienna summit the previous year and walked away convinced that the young American president was weak, inexperienced, a man who could be moved if you pushed hard enough. Khrushchev had been testing that conclusion ever since. Now he had pushed all the way to 90 miles off American shores, and Kennedy understood, with absolute clarity, what was truly at stake. Not just a military confrontation, a fundamental question about American resolve, about credibility, about whether the leader of the free world could be outmaneuvered on the world stage with an election just weeks away. Within hours, Kennedy assembled the executive committee of the National Security Council, ExComm. 14 men, secretaries, generals, advisors, the most seasoned foreign policy minds in the country, gathered around a table to answer a question that had no good answer. What do you do when your enemy has placed nuclear weapons 90 miles from your shore? The options laid out before them were not theoretical. Each one carried the weight of potential catastrophe. The first option was a surgical airstrike, take out the missile sites before they became operational. Clean, decisive, except, as the Air Force's own experts quietly admitted, it would not be clean. Intelligence could not guarantee every missile would be destroyed, and if even one survived, If even one Soviet officer with launch authority decided that the American attack meant war had already started, the calculation became unsurvivable. The second option was a full-scale military invasion. 40,000 troops, airborne assault, naval landing, the complete dismantling of Soviet military capability on Cuban soil. And this is the option that would have most certainly triggered nuclear fire, because intelligence revealed, decades later, that the Soviets had already deployed tactical nuclear weapons to Cuba with launch authority pre-delegated to local commanders. An American invasion force hitting Cuban beaches could have been met with nuclear weapons before a single general in Moscow was even notified. Nobody in that room knew this. That knowledge came later, at conference tables between former enemies who compared notes and watched each other go pale. The third option was a naval blockade, called a quarantine, because under international law blockade is an act of war. Intercept Soviet ships, demand the missiles be removed. By time, it was the least aggressive choice available. It was also the option that handed the first move entirely to the Soviets. Kennedy chose the quarantine. And the question that should sit with you in this moment is not whether that was the right call, it's the weight of making any call at all. If you were in that room, knowing that every option on the table could end civilization, and knowing that doing nothing was equally unacceptable, how do you decide? How do you choose when every choice is potentially the last one? For 6 days after that decision, XCOM met in total secrecy. 6 days during which ordinary Americans drove their children to school, bought groceries, watched the evening news, and had no idea that 14 men in Washington were quietly debating whether those ordinary lives were about to end. The secrecy was deliberate. Kennedy understood that the moment the news broke, public panic would generate overwhelming political pressure for immediate military action, and the Soviets would know that America knew, triggering whatever contingency plans Khrushchev had already set in motion. But keeping secrets in Washington is like trying to hold water in your fists. On October 22nd, Kennedy addressed the nation. The speech itself is one of the most remarkable acts of presidential communication in American history, not for its words, but for the impossible weight the man delivering it was carrying as he spoke. He told the American people that Soviet nuclear missiles were in Cuba. He announced the quarantine. He warned Khrushchev directly that any missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be considered an attack by the Soviet Union upon the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response. Across the country, people stopped moving and stared at their television screens in absolute silence. In Moscow, Khrushchev reportedly threw the translated text of the speech across his office. In Cuba, Fidel Castro put his military on full combat alert. And in the Atlantic Ocean, 22 Soviet ships were already cutting through the water toward the quarantine line, each one carrying cargo that the world was not yet ready to understand. The quarantine line was drawn 500 miles from the coast of Cuba. American naval vessels, stretched in a vast arc across the Atlantic, were ordered to intercept any Soviet ship attempting to cross. The rules of engagement were precise, deliberate, and terrifying in their implications. If a Soviet ship refused to stop, American vessels were authorized to fire warning shots across the bow. If the ship continued to advance, American sailors were authorized to disable it by force. One miscalculation, one captain on either side who decided that holding his course was a matter of national honor he could not surrender, and 15 years of Cold War theorizing would transform instantly into real fire on real ships in real water. On October 24th, the Soviet vessels approaching the quarantine line did something unexpected. They stopped. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, watching the situation in real time, turned to McGeorge Bundy and delivered one of the most quoted lines of the entire Cold War. He said, "We're eyeball to eyeball." And I think the other fellow just blinked. But stopping was not the same as retreating. The missiles in Cuba were still there. Construction was still ongoing. U-2 photographs showed Soviet crews working through the night, racing to make those launch sites fully operational before any diplomatic resolution could be reached. Time was running out in both directions at once. And now here is the moment that history almost lost entirely. The moment that, when it was finally declassified decades later, caused former defense officials and professional historians to go visibly shaken on camera, while the world's attention was locked on those Soviet surface ships near the quarantine line. For Soviet submarines were operating beneath the Atlantic, nuclear-armed submarines, each one carrying a torpedo tipped with a nuclear warhead equivalent in destructive power to the bomb that leveled Hiroshima. American destroyers searching for Soviet submarines located one of them, B-59, and began dropping practice depth charges. These were signaling devices, not weapons. The American ships were attempting to force the submarine to surface and identify itself. But inside B-59, the crew had been completely out of radio contact for days. They did not know whether war had already started. The depth charges were shaking the hull. The batteries were failing. Carbon dioxide levels had risen to the point where men were losing consciousness at their stations. And the submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, made a decision. He said they were going to launch under Soviet naval protocol. Launching the nuclear torpedo required the agreement of 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the brigade commander. The captain wanted to fire. The political officer agreed. The torpedo was being prepared for launch. The brigade commander was a man named Vasily Arkhipov, and Vasily Arkhipov said no. He argued. He held his position. He refused to authorize the launch. He convinced Savitsky to surface the submarine instead. One man, one refusal. On a suffocating vessel at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, with explosions shaking the hull and men collapsing around him. The entire cascade that would have followed the retaliatory American nuclear strike. The Soviet response. The full exchange of warheads across 2 hemispheres, all of it was prevented because one officer in an impossible situation chose, against every screaming instinct of that moment, not to fire. When this story finally became known, historian and National Security Archive Director Thomas Blanton said simply, "A guy called Vasily Arkhipov saved the world." Sit with that. A man whose name most people have never heard, on a submarine that most people never knew existed, made the decision that kept you alive. The Cuban Missile Crisis gets taught as a confrontation between giants, Kennedy and Khrushchev. 2 superpowers, 2 sets of missiles, a chess match between the most powerful men on Earth. But the real story is about ordinary human beings who were frightened, exhausted, operating on incomplete and sometimes completely wrong information, making decisions in seconds that would echo for generations. That is the history that deserves to be told completely and honestly, not as political legend, not as national mythology, but as what it actually was, a terrifying, deeply human near-miss that came down, repeatedly, to whether one individual in one specific moment could resist the pull toward catastrophe. This is the mission of History Unlocked, to go past the surface, to recover the full weight of the moments that made the world we inherited. If that matters to you, then stay close, because this is a community built around the belief that understanding history accurately is not optional. It is necessary. While Arkhipov was holding his ground inside B-59, Kennedy and Khrushchev were engaged in something that had no real precedent in the history of modern diplomacy: a direct, private correspondence that bypassed the formal machinery of international relations almost entirely. The letters were long, personal, in places almost painfully candid. On the night of October 26th, Khrushchev wrote something that genuinely surprised every member of XCOM when it was read aloud. He described the crisis as 2 men pulling from opposite ends of a rope with a knot in the middle, and warned that the harder both men pulled, the tighter the knot would become. He proposed a deal. The Soviets would remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States pledged never to invade the island. Kennedy read that letter and felt, for the first time in 10 days, that there might be an actual exit from the darkness. Then the next morning arrived. Before any response could be sent, a second letter came. This one had a completely different character, harder, more formal, more political in tone, and it contained a new demand. The Americans would also have to remove their Jupiter missiles from Turkey. XCOM fell into controlled chaos. Which letter was the real Khrushchev? Which one reflected actual Soviet policy? Had hardliners in Moscow overruled him overnight? Was the second letter a trap designed to humiliate the United States publicly? Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and attorney general, proposed something that was either strategically brilliant or diplomatically reckless, depending entirely on what happened next. Ignore the second letter. Respond only to the first. Accept the no invasion pledge publicly. Handle the Turkey missiles quietly through a secret back channel. and pray that Khrushchev accepted the terms before the situation on the ground made any diplomatic solution irrelevant. It was a gamble of the highest possible order. Then October 27th arrived, and history has a name for what that day became: Black Saturday. In a single day, events unfolded that, taken together, represent the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. An American U-2 spy plane, drifting off course during a routine mission in the Arctic, accidentally crossed into Soviet airspace. Soviet fighters scrambled. American fighters scrambled to intercept the Soviet fighters. For approximately 30 minutes, armed military aircraft from both superpowers were operating in dangerous proximity over Soviet territory while nuclear war protocols activated on both sides. The U-2 eventually navigated back to international airspace, but not before Kennedy was told what had happened. He reportedly put his head in his hands and said, "There is always some son of a bitch who doesn't get the word." And before that crisis within a crisis had even fully resolved, a second U-2, this one on a legitimate reconnaissance mission over Cuba, was shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson, was killed. He was the only American combat casualty of the entire Cuban Missile Crisis. Most Americans could not tell you his name today. Inside XCOM, the pressure to respond militarily became nearly uncontainable. The rules of engagement Kennedy had authorized were explicit. If an American aircraft was fired upon, the United States would destroy the responsible missile battery. The military commanders were ready. The aircraft were armed and standing by. Kennedy refused to give the order. He absorbed the pressure from every direction. He overruled his generals. He chose, for the second and third and fourth time in as many hours, to hold, to wait, to resist the momentum that was pulling every person in that room toward a military response that might trigger the end of everything. What does it take to hold that kind of stillness inside that kind of storm? That question deserves to live beyond this documentary. By nightfall on Black Saturday, Robert Kennedy met in complete secrecy with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin and laid out the terms one final time: the no invasion pledge, in exchange for the removal of the missiles. And then, quietly, he added the element that could never be spoken publicly: the Jupiter missiles in Turkey would be removed within several months. But this piece of the arrangement had to remain entirely secret. Dobrynin contacted Moscow. Kennedy's team went home to wait through the longest night of the crisis. No one slept. October 28th, 1962. Early morning. Radio Moscow broadcast a statement from Nikita Khrushchev. The Soviet Union would dismantle its missiles and remove them from Cuba. Inside the White House, men who had not slept properly in nearly 2 weeks, who had been carrying the weight of potential extinction through every waking hour, sat very still. Some wept quietly. Some shook hands without saying anything. Some simply stared at the walls. Kennedy, alone for a moment, reportedly said nothing at all. The crisis was over. Except it was not over, not quite. Not the way history has typically chosen to present it. The secret agreement regarding the Jupiter missiles in Turkey would remain classified for nearly 30 years. When it finally became public, it reframed the entire story. Kennedy had not simply stood firm and forced the Soviets to back down. He had given ground carefully, quietly, in a way that preserved American credibility on the surface while giving Khrushchev something real and tangible to bring home. It was not simply an American victory. It was something more sophisticated and, in many ways, more admirable: a negotiated escape from catastrophe in which both sides were given just enough to step back from the edge without appearing to have surrendered. That is not the version of the story that was taught in American classrooms for the next 3 decades. And that gap between the public narrative and what actually happened in those rooms is precisely why history demands to be revisited with honest eyes and a willingness to carry the full weight of what it reveals. Now return to where this story began. The officer alone at his post. The screen showing 5 incoming American missiles. His name was Stanislav Petrov. But his moment did not happen in 1962. It happened on September 26, 1983, 21 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. In a world that had supposedly learned from the nearest brush with nuclear war in its history, a Soviet early warning satellite system malfunctioned and reported a United States first strike. Petrov's protocol was unambiguous: report the launch immediately up the chain of command. That report, in that moment, would have triggered a Soviet retaliatory strike within minutes. Instead, Petrov reasoned. He questioned the data. He noted that a genuine American first strike would involve hundreds of missiles simultaneously, not 5 in isolation. He decided, without any certainty whatsoever and with everything on the line, that the system was lying to him. He was right. The Cuban Missile Crisis gave the world a framework for understanding the fragility of nuclear peace. Petrov's moment reveals that the framework was tested again and again in the years that followed, and that each time civilization survived, its survival came down not to protocols or treaties or military doctrine, but to individual human beings choosing, alone in the dark, not to end the world. In the aftermath of October 1962, Kennedy and Khrushchev established the Moscow-Washington hotline, not the red telephone of popular imagination, but a direct teletype system designed specifically to prevent the kind of communication breakdown that had nearly consumed everything. Nuclear test ban negotiations that had existed only as theoretical discussions became urgent international priorities. The world did not become safe, but it became, measurably, more careful about how close it allowed itself to drift toward the edge. Robert McNamara, Kennedy's Secretary of Defense and one of the most analytically rigorous members of ExComm, spent the final decades of his life doing something remarkable. He traveled the world and met with former Soviet and Cuban officials, reconstructing every phase of the crisis with meticulous precision, attempting to understand not just what happened but exactly how close the margin truly was. At the conclusion of that long process of reconstruction, McNamara offered his final assessment of the Cuban Missile Crisis not in the language of strategy or geopolitics or national strength, but in a single, stark sentence. He said, "We lucked out. Not strategy, not American resolve, not the superiority of democratic values over Soviet authoritarianism. Luck. A submarine officer who said no. A president who refused to order the retaliatory strike. A letter that arrived before the window closed. An early warning officer who trusted his instincts over his instruments. Remove any single one of those human choices, replace any one of those individuals with someone slightly more rigid, slightly more frightened, slightly more convinced that following the protocol was the only honorable course of action, and this story does not get told. This documentary does not exist. You do not exist. The world you were born into was not inevitable. It was assembled, piece by fragile piece, from decisions made under extreme pressure by imperfect people who were just as afraid as you would have been in their place. That is not a comforting thought. It is a clarifying one, because it means the world being passed forward right now is also being assembled, piece by fragile piece, from decisions being made today by people who are equally afraid, equally imperfect, and equally capable of either holding or letting go. Vasily Arkhipov never received a medal for saving the world. Stanislav Petrov was reprimanded by his superiors for failing to follow the correct protocol on the night he prevented nuclear war. Rudolf Anderson was buried with quiet honors and largely forgotten by the country that sent him into that airspace. Kennedy's secret concession was hidden from the American public for a generation. The people who actually kept civilization intact during those 13 days were not celebrated. In most cases, they were obscured by classification, by politics, by the persistent and self-serving mythology that great powers survive great crises through strength and strategy alone, never through the fragile conscience of a single individual in a single impossible moment. History Unlocked exists because the full truth, not the comfortable version, not the politically convenient version, but the actual weight of what happened and how close it came is not merely worth knowing. It is necessary. A world that does not understand how close it came to ending cannot fully understand what it means to still be here. And so the question that should stay with you, long after the screen goes dark and the narration fades, if the survival of civilization has depended, again and again, not on systems or protocols or the declared strength of superpowers, but on the conscience of individual human beings making unrepeatable choices in unrepeatable moments, what does that ask of you? Right now, in the world you currently occupy, the missiles came down, the ships turned back, the submarines surfaced, and in an alternate history that very nearly became the only history, none of this remained to be told. History Unlocked exists so that it is.